If you've ever wondered what is the difference between policy and politics, keep on watching.
Okay, this shouldn't be so hard.
Oh my god, just spit it out, David.
Oh my god, fine!
In this video, I'm going to clear up the difference between politics and policy by defining each. I'll then discuss some of the ways that politics can drive policy, and at the end, stick around as I discuss how skillful leaders can sometimes turn good policy into good politics. So let's start with the question of what is policy? A simple definition is that policy is a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual to address a problem or set of issues. The Center for Civic Education defines public policy as what a government official, including school officials, city council members, county supervisors, Congress, etc., does or does not do about a problem that comes before them for consideration and for possible action. So let's consider a very real example that governments around the world have had to contend with for several years. That is the COVID-19 pandemic.
These are dark times, John.
The onset of this pandemic raised many important issues of public health, education, the economy, and schools, to name a few. Some of the questions that come up for policymakers include whether to shut down business, schools, and services. What kinds of health mandates should be put in place, from wearing masks to social distancing to vaccines? What, if any, economic support might be given to those who had to stop working or who maybe lost their jobs as a result of the tumult? What steps should be taken to ensure that individuals and businesses had access to vaccines or tests or PPE? So, in an ideal world, these decisions will be made by professionals who are steeped in medical science or the economy or education, based on what their expertise and best practice from years of study suggest should be the most appropriate course of action. In setting policy, there are really 5 key steps. First is what we call agenda setting. So in this stage, the problem or the challenge is identified and the stakeholders are invited to put forward their comments, their ideas, or suggestions for addressing the issues. The second stage is called policy formation. Here, officials will narrow down the possible policy choices, eliminate those that are not feasible, involve experts from various disciplines to weigh in, and then make a case for their preferred choices. The third step in policymaking is decision-making. Here, whoever is charged with making the decision, perhaps a mayor or a governor or the president or a CDC advisory panel, will actually make the decision. For example, a decision might be made after many stakeholders have been consulted and after a long dialogue looking at the pros and cons of various approaches to, let's say, recommend that Americans receive a booster shot for COVID. Now, in a well-run policymaking process, this decision isn't made on the spur of the moment or just by the director of the CDC based on her opinion alone. Instead, it comes after various stakeholders with expertise on everything from infectious disease to supply chains to statistics weigh in, and then after there's a lot of robust conversation and deliberation. Once the decision is made, however, the fourth important part of policymaking is implementation. So implementation requires an immense amount of planning and expertise. Consider this recent example. When Joe Biden became president, the United States had already pledged to end the war in Afghanistan by May 1st. After consulting with military, diplomatic, and other experts through a policymaking process, the president decided to extend that deadline for withdrawal to 9/11. Now, as in all policymaking, the president's decision received a wide range of responses. Many Americans, however, largely agreed with the decision to leave Afghanistan after 20 years of never-ending and costly war. But the next step was policy implementation. And as most observers agree, the implementation of that decision was far from successful. Most of us who are paying attention remember the chaotic departure of Americans from the airport in Kabul and the truly heartbreaking pictures of thousands of Afghans who had supported the United States and Americans for years simply being left behind. Even speaking about this feels tragic and sad and frankly emotional to me. The policy implementation step had failed miserably. So the last step of policymaking then is evaluation. In this phase, officials and other stakeholders come together to review how the overall process, from the agenda setting to the implementation, has gone. In an ongoing situation like COVID-19, the purpose is to make adjustments and changes to correct for errors and to adapt to the current situation. In an example like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where the event is over, evaluation is still really important because it helps policymakers cull lessons so that mistakes can be avoided in the future. For some listeners hearing this, I hope this sounds wildly different from politics. Good policymaking requires technical expertise, intentional process, and structured reasoning. When you hear someone being described as a policy wonk, and I consider myself a policy wonk, it typically means that they find the minutiae involved in decision making like this exciting. I also hope that as you hear this, it sounds very different from what you might think of as politics. So, what is politics? There is a big question. But in theory, politics is the process by which policy gets made, and it might follow the organized steps outlined above. But theory and practice do not typically line up, because in practice, politics has come to mean something very different. Politics is the means by which decisions are made, but it really refers to authority and public life. Politics involves the way by which individuals come to gain formal authority within a government or organization to make decisions about the policy. So the kind of news you typically get on CNN or Fox or OAN or MSNBC is focused a lot on politics, but sadly very little on policy. Politics involves that whole set of processes by which individuals gain authority in a society. In the United States, that means running campaigns, raising money, persuading voters. And once elected, politics also involves the relationship and the coalition building that individuals and parties make to enshrine their policy platform into law. In a democracy such as ours, it would be ideal if policy considerations drove politics. Unfortunately, most political discussions only touch policy at the margins. Instead, politics typically involves being seen as charismatic, approachable, creative, tough, visionary. It also means raising enough money to get people to know your name and think of you as some form of likable. So that means there's a really big gap between politicians and policymakers. A politician may know a lot about policy, but often they don't know that much about it. They might have a few general ideas or policy directions, and instead worry about impression management, getting their name out to others in a positive way, conveying confidence, building a campaign war chest, and winning votes. So this leads to the next question. How does politics drive policy? So here's the part of the video where my aspirational, nerdy, wonky side clashes with the real world in which we all live. Because in theory, policy is driven by data, expertise, knowledge, and research. The kinds of things that scholars study and do at, schools of public policy, let's say. But in fact, the messy world of politics has a very powerful impact on how policies get made. That is public perception, public opinion, clever messaging, charisma, and dare I say it, the whims of the moment are often the real drivers of policy formation. If perception and image are not driving policy decisions, at the very least, they are constraining and shaping them. So let's consider the recent example from the COVID-19 Omicron surge that occurred right before Christmas. On December 12th, the head of the World Health Organization advised persons to cancel their Christmas plans with families, citing the speed of transmission, the likelihood that hospitals would be overwhelmed, and the unknown potency of the virus. That's a policymaker talking. On December 21st, in an address to the American people, President Biden said it was not necessary to cancel Christmas plans, especially if you are vaccinated and boosted. That is the voice of a politician talking. There are two policy recommendations, of course, at odds with each other. Now, it is entirely possible that the two results derived entirely from objective assessments of the dangers of COVID. But I'd say it's much more likely that President Biden's message was shaped, at least in part, by political realities. The willingness of the American people to sit out another Christmas was very, very low. A political leader who suggests canceling Christmas would likely lose popularity and put his own credibility and prestige on the line. After all, COVID restrictions are already a polarizing issue in the United States, where Democrats like President Biden were routinely ridiculed by Republicans for trying to impose too much control on individual liberty and decision-making. So in this case, it's likely that political realities might have been driving a policy decision. Now, it's not always the case that political constraints are driving policy decisions. Sometimes, a very thoughtful leader can turn a good policy into good politics. This isn't always the thing to do because it involves taking risks, and of course, it involves really good negotiation skills. All too often, politicians, those who practice politics, fail to lead when it comes to policymaking. They are more concerned about being popular. But really good leaders listen to their policy wonks, look at the relevant information, and then find a way to frame issues and choices that might take a skeptical public and turn them around. One of the political leaders who was most adept at doing this was Michael Bloomberg, the former Republican mayor of New York City. For most of us, we take the fact that smoking is not allowed in restaurants and bars for granted. If you're under the age of 35, the notion that people would be smoking in restaurants at bars might even seem preposterous to you, or maybe even totally gross.
Ew!
But this was not always the case. Sadly, I am old enough to remember when going to a bar, whether you smoked or not, was synonymous with being in a smoke-filled room and coming home with these really smelly clothes at night. But then in 2002, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg banned smoking in all of the city's bars and restaurants. When he did this, I remember being stunned and thankful that I lived in Boston and not New York City. Now, to be clear, I am not a smoker, but even then I thought, how awful, how terrible to go to a bar and then there's no smoking. I mean, this ruins the entire vibe. And indeed, at first, Bloomberg suffered huge blowback for this decision. But he had gathered enormous amounts of data about just how many lives would be extended and saved by this decision. And he then deployed an effective public relations campaign. He framed this decision in leadership terms, describing how once again, New York would be the trend-setting city and that the rest of the world would follow. Guess what? He was right. In 2011, he banned smoking in outdoor areas such as parks and beaches. And indeed, Bloomberg was also responsible for being the first city to pass a law requiring food service providers to show calorie counts on menus. What sounded like a crazy and unpopular idea had caught on. Now let's take another example. Under Michael Bloomberg's leadership, large parts of some of New York's busiest streets were transformed into walking pedestrian neighborhoods. Again, at first glance, a policy decision to narrow or remove roads seemed wildly unpopular politically. But by framing this decision in gaining public space and public access, he was able to transform this good policy decision into good politics. So, as I think you can tell, I'm a bit of a policy wonk. I do a lot of professional work helping parties create processes for coming up with wise and sustainable policy making. But I'm also a political nerd. I love the intrigue, the relationship building, the schmoozing, and all the strategery involved in the world of politics. So even though much of the time politics drives policymaking, I'm also really fascinated how leaders with vision and, oh, guess what, good negotiation skills can make good policymaking into good politics. Which leads me to suggest another video on my channel. I want you to check out Have Political Parties Become Too Polarized? So thanks for sticking around, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and like so you don't miss out on any content. And if you're interested in how leaders can negotiate policymaking with wisdom and an eye to managing political complexities, consider taking one of the workshops I teach at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. And don't forget to keep watching for more about policymaking, politics, polarization, and how we can negotiate and mediate our way through our many national challenges. I'm Bob Bordone. Let's keep negotiating together. Click the video. The thumbnail has Trump and Biden on it. How could you possibly not be intrigued?